I failed high school Spanish. Not barely failed, not scraped by with a D and moved on. Genuinely failed. Twice. The second time in summer school with a teacher who, I'm fairly certain, passed me out of pure exhaustion rather than any real evidence I'd learned the subjunctive tense. I tell you that specific, slightly embarrassing detail because I think it matters for what happened 49 years later. When I found myself standing in a pharmacy in Puerto Vallarta, 70 years old, having an entire conversation about my blood pressure medication with a pharmacist who spoke almost no English, using a mix of my broken Spanish, her patient hand gestures, and a translation app neither of us fully trusted, and walking out 10 minutes later with exactly what I needed, understood completely, cared for completely, by a woman who never once made me feel like the language barrier between us was actually a barrier at all. I remember standing outside that pharmacy afterward, prescription bag in hand, feeling a specific kind of astonishment that had nothing to do with the medication itself. Somewhere behind me was a version of myself who'd spent decades certain that exact interaction was permanently beyond my reach. And here I was, having just completed it, imperfectly, patiently, and entirely successfully, with a woman who'd clearly navigated 100 conversations exactly like it before mine, and would navigate 100 more after. I want to talk honestly about fear, because I think fear of language is one of the biggest, quietest reasons so many women my age never seriously consider a move like this, even when everything else about it, the cost of living, the climate, the community, sounds appealing. I carried that specific fear for years, decades really, long before Mexico was ever a real consideration. I am 70 years old, and I spent 38 years as a bookkeeper for a family-owned furniture business in Nashville, Tennessee, a job I was genuinely good at, precise, reliable, the kind of person people trusted with numbers. But languages were never my strength. And somewhere along the way, after that humiliating summer school class at 17, I built an entire private narrative around it, that I simply wasn't capable of learning another language, that whatever part of the brain handles that particular skill had somehow been left out of mine. That narrative shaped more of my life than I think I fully realized until much later. I turned down a work trip to Mexico City in my 30s because the thought of navigating it without fluent Spanish terrified me more than I let on to my supervisor, who ended up sending a younger colleague instead. I avoided an entire category of vacation destinations for decades, sticking to English-speaking countries or heavily touristed resorts where I could stay safely insulated inside an all-inclusive bubble. When my husband Gerald first mentioned retiring somewhere abroad, sometime in our early 60s, Mexico specifically, based on some research he'd been doing about cost of living, I shut the conversation down almost immediately, before he'd even finished his sentence, telling him I could never live somewhere I couldn't properly communicate. I think, looking back, that fear had less to do with actual language ability and more to do with a very old, very specific memory of humiliation. Standing at the chalkboard in that portable classroom at 17, unable to conjugate a verb correctly while the rest of the class waited, a teacher's visible impatience, a few classmates' badly concealed laughter. I carried that particular scene with me for over 50 years, using it, without ever quite realizing it, as proof of a permanent limitation rather than what it actually was, which was one bad experience in one badly taught class at an age when almost everything feels like permanent proof of something. I built an entire identity around being someone who simply couldn't do languages. The same certain, settled way I knew I was good with numbers. And I never once, in nearly 5 decades, thought to question whether that identity was actually true or simply old. Gerald passed away 4 years ago. A stroke. Sudden. And I won't dwell on that part of the story, except to say that grief has a way of clarifying exactly which of your old fears were ever really about the thing you thought they were about. About a year after he died, going through old files, I found a folder he'd kept. Cost of living comparisons. Photographs of Puerto Vallarta he'd printed out. Notes in his own handwriting about a retirement he'd clearly been quietly researching for months before he ever brought it up to me. A retirement I'd shut down in under 30 seconds. Because of a fear I'd been carrying since I was 17 years old and failing a language class in a portable classroom behind Hillsborough High School. Sitting on the floor of our home office with that folder in my lap, I felt something I hadn't expected. Which was less grief, though there was plenty of that too, and more a kind of quiet, uncomfortable shame. Gerald had never pushed the idea after that first conversation. He'd simply let it go. The way he let go of most things I felt strongly about, out of respect for me rather than any lack of wanting it himself, and I understood, looking at those printed photographs, dated on the back in his careful handwriting nearly 4 years before he died, that I'd taken something from him without ever really examining whether the reason I'd taken it was even legitimate. He never once brought it up again after that first conversation. I only found out how much he'd actually wanted it after he was no longer here to tell me himself. I sat with that folder for a long time. I want to be honest that finding it didn't send me on some immediate dramatic journey to Mexico. What it did was make me finally ask myself a question I'd avoided for decades, which was whether the fear I'd been organizing so many decisions around was actually based on anything real, or whether it was simply an old story I'd never bothered to fact-check. So I started researching, properly, the way I used to reconcile a set of books that didn't balance, looking for the actual gap between what I assumed and what was true. I found expat forums specifically addressing this exact fear. Hundreds of posts from retirees who'd moved to Mexico with little or no Spanish and built full connected lives anyway. I learned that Puerto Vallarta specifically, along with several other retiree hubs, has such an established, decades-long American and Canadian community that a genuine bilingual infrastructure exists almost everywhere. English-speaking doctors, bilingual real estate agents, pharmacies used to serving retirees, restaurants with staff who switch effortlessly between languages depending on who's ordering. I read about free and low-cost Spanish classes specifically designed for retirees, taught with patience and without the humiliating pace of a high school classroom. I watched video after video of women exactly my age describing the same fear I'd carried for decades, and the same discovery, again and again, that it had turned out to matter far less than they'd expected. I want to be honest that the research alone didn't fully convince me, not the way a column of correctly reconciled numbers would have. Fear built over 50 years doesn't dissolve because of a few forum posts and a spreadsheet, however thorough. What actually shifted something was a single video, one I watched 3 times, of a woman in her 70s from Ohio describing, almost offhandedly, an entire friendship she'd built with her next-door neighbor in Mexico despite neither of them sharing more than a handful of words in the other's language, built instead out of shared coffee, patient gesturing, and what the woman called, with a laugh, enough goodwill to fill in the gaps. I didn't fully believe her, but I wanted to. That wanting turned out to be enough to get me on a plane. I flew down for a 2-week trip that spring, alone, deliberately choosing not to stay in a resort, renting instead a small apartment in the Olas Altas neighborhood, close enough to daily life that I couldn't hide inside an English-speaking bubble even if I wanted to. My first morning, terrified, I walked 3 blocks to a small cafe for coffee, rehearsing a simple order in my head the entire way like I was back in that portable classroom preparing for a pop quiz. The woman behind the counter, maybe 60, listened to my halting, badly accented attempt, smiled, and answered partly in English, partly in Spanish, filling in gaps for me without a hint of impatience. The way you'd help a friend, rather than correct a stranger. I sat down with my coffee afterward and, I'll admit it, teared up a little, because I'd just done, successfully, the exact thing I'd spent 49 years telling myself I was incapable of doing. That 2 weeks became a slow, steady dismantling of the story I'd been carrying. I found a small language exchange group that met twice a week in a courtyard near the Malican. Mexican retirees wanting to practice their English sitting alongside American and Canadian retirees wanting to practice Spanish. Everyone equally imperfect. Everyone equally patient with everyone else's mistakes. I met a woman there named Alejandra, a retired schoolteacher herself, who told me, laughing, that she'd spent 30 years teaching children and had never once met an adult who learned a language through fear and shame. Only ever through consistent, low-stakes, genuinely enjoyable practice. Which was exactly the opposite of the environment I'd been taught in at 17. I went back to that group 4 more times over my remaining 2 weeks, watching each session as my terror slowly recalibrated into something closer to ordinary discomfort. The kind you can actually work through rather than the kind that simply shuts a door permanently. Alejandra took a particular interest in my progress, partly, she admitted, because my specific fear reminded her of a student she'd taught decades earlier who'd struggled similarly. And partly, I think, because she simply enjoyed the challenge of proving a stubborn 70-year-old wrong about her own capabilities. She taught me a handful of practical phrases each session, nothing academic, just what I'd actually need at the market or the pharmacy, and made me practice them out loud immediately, in the room, with real people, rather than silently in a notebook the way I'd always imagined language learning had to work. By my last session before flying home, I managed an entire 5-minute conversation with a retired Mexican gentleman named Scar about our respective grandchildren. Halting. Grammatically incorrect. Full of pauses while I searched for words, and completely, genuinely understood on both ends. I remember walking back to my rental afterward, feeling something close to disbelief. The specific vertigo of discovering, at 70, that a story I'd told myself with absolute certainty for 53 years had simply, quietly, been wrong the entire time. I moved to Puerto Vallarta permanently that October, 7 months after that first trip, into a small casita 2 streets from Alejandra's, and I want to tell you honestly that my Spanish, even now, over 2 years later, remains genuinely imperfect. I still mix up verb tenses constantly. I still reach for my translation app more often than I'd like at the pharmacy or the doctor's office. But here is what I understand now that I didn't understand at 17. Sitting humiliated in that portable classroom. Or at 63, shutting down Gerald's entire retirement dream in 30 seconds flat. Fluency was never actually the requirement I'd built it up to be in my head. Connection was the requirement. And connection turns out to be built from something considerably more forgiving than grammar. If any of you are carrying your own version of that fear, the old story about a language class or a trip that went badly, or simply a general conviction that you're not capable of learning something new at this stage of life, I want you to comment below and tell me about it, because I read every single one. And I think a great many of us are letting a decades-old story make decisions for us that the actual evidence doesn't support. I know I did, for 53 years, without ever once checking whether the evidence had changed, or whether it had ever really been sound to begin with. My weekly language exchange with Alejandra's group continues, 2 years running now, and I've watched my own Spanish improve slowly, unevenly, through exactly the kind of low-pressure repetition she promised me it would, rather than any dramatic breakthrough. I've built real friendships here. With Alejandra, with 2 other retired American women from the exchange group, with my next-door neighbor, Rosa, who brings me tamales on Sundays and has taught me more practical, useful Spanish over her kitchen table than 4 years of failed high school ever did. Rosa doesn't speak more than a handful of English words, and I don't let that stop either of us anymore. We've developed our own particular shorthand over 2 years. Part Spanish, part English, part gesture, part the specific patience two women build when they've decided a friendship matters more than perfect communication, and some of my favorite hours here are simply sitting on her porch on a Sunday evening, imperfectly understanding maybe 80% of what she says, and finding that 80% is entirely enough to feel genuinely close to someone. My monthly expenses run around $1,600. The casita, groceries, my share of a weekly dinner rotation with friends from the exchange group, comfortably covered by Gerald's pension, and my own Social Security, with enough left over that I've started taking a proper, structured Spanish class twice a week. Not out of necessity, but because I've finally, at 70, discovered I actually enjoy it, which is its own small miracle I don't take for granted. My instructor, a patient young woman named Fernanda, told me during my first lesson that adult learners almost always progress faster than they expect. Specifically because we bring context and motivation a 17-year-old rarely has, and I believed her more than I believed my own doubts, which felt, at the time, like its own small act of rebellion against the girl I used to be in that portable classroom. My daughter, Michelle, back in Nashville, was skeptical when I first told her about the move, gently pointing out, the way adult children do, that I'd literally failed Spanish twice in high school, as though she needed to remind me of a fact I'd been quietly organizing my whole life around. She visited last spring, watched me navigate the market, chat with Rosa over the fence, order confidently at Alejandra's favorite restaurant, and admitted, over dinner that last night, that she genuinely expected to find me isolated, struggling, regretting the decision. Instead, she found me more socially connected than I'd been in years back in Nashville, in a language I still don't speak particularly well, which she said made no sense to her at all. She sat with Rosa and me on the porch one evening, watching our particular shorthand in action, and afterward asked me, half amazed, how we actually understood each other. I told her the truth, which is that we didn't. Not completely. Not the way two people sharing a first language understand each other, but that the gap turned out to matter far less than either of us expected. Because friendship, it turns out, is built more out of patience and consistent presence than out of grammatical precision. Michelle admitted, a little sheepishly, that she'd spent 2 years assuming her mother's Mexican life was somehow smaller or lonelier for the language gap, and that watching it in person had corrected an assumption she hadn't realized she was still carrying on my behalf. The pharmacist who helped me with my blood pressure medication that first difficult week didn't need my grammar to be correct. She needed me to keep trying, and she needed to be patient while I did, and between the two of us, imperfectly. In a mix of 2 languages and a translation app we didn't fully trust, we got exactly where we needed to go. I thought I needed to speak Spanish to retire in Mexico. I was wrong. Not because language doesn't matter at all. It does. And I'm glad I'm slowly getting better at it. But because I'd built fluency into an impossible gatekeeper standing between me and an entire life I could have started decades earlier, if I'd ever bothered to question a story I picked up at 17 in a portable classroom from a teacher who, frankly, probably shouldn't have been teaching Spanish either. Gerald knew, somehow, before I did, that the life he was quietly researching didn't require what I thought it required. I only wish I'd trusted that folder sooner, and trusted him sooner, instead of trusting a 53-year-old memory of humiliation more than I trusted my own husband's careful research or my own capacity to simply try something imperfectly and see what happened. I'm here now anyway, imperfect Spanish and all, and I think, wherever he is, he'd tell you that's exactly enough. I'm Sandra Hawkins. Thank you for listening to Women Choose Mexico.